A shape peeled away from the cave wall at the very bottom of Belize's Great Blue Hole, roughly 125 meters down, and drifted past an underwater drone's camera so slowly that the pilot watching the feed didn't register it as alive until it was already gone. That drone wasn't down there for tourism, and it wasn't down there for science either, not officially. It existed because a woman named Elena Cruz had spent 6 years asking someone, anyone, to send something back to the exact spot where her brother's dive computer had finally turned up. He didn't drift there. Danny Cruz went missing in the Great Blue Hole 9 years ago on a technical dive he wasn't certified for, and everyone who knew him swears he wouldn't have attempted alone. The official file calls it nitrogen narcosis, a diver disoriented at depth, wandering past his limit until his air simply ran out. Elena signed that file too, back when signing things felt easier than arguing with grief. Danny was the reckless one growing up, and Elena was the one who talked him down off ledges, literal and otherwise, for most of their childhood. She still keeps his old logbook on her kitchen table, not out of sentiment, she says, but because the last entry stops mid-sentence, and something about an unfinished sentence in his own handwriting felt too much like an accusation to put away in a drawer. Then, 3 years ago, a fisherman's anchor snagged something near the hole's northern wall that turned out to be Danny's dive computer, encrusted in a thin mineral crust nobody could immediately explain. It was recovered nowhere close to where the current in that cove actually runs. Elena isn't a marine biologist, and she isn't an engineer either. She spent those 6 years learning just enough of both to keep asking better questions, the kind the reserve authorities stopped answering politely somewhere around year 4. Currents in that cove run east, consistently according to 3 separate hydrology surveys the reserve authority itself commissioned over the years. Danny's gear was found northwest of where he vanished. So which is it? Did Danny swim 300 feet past his own depth limit, against a current no diver could fight while disoriented? Or did something else decide where he ended up? Before we get to what the drone actually filmed, hit subscribe, because the answer to that question is the reason this footage almost never left a private hard drive. Most people who've heard of the Great Blue Hole don't know this part, and it matters for everything that happens next. Roughly 90 meters down, the water stops behaving like water divers understand. A thick layer of hydrogen sulfide gas sits suspended there, and beneath it, oxygen all but disappears. A handful of specialized microbes are already known to survive down there anyway, wrapping themselves in a mineral coating to keep the chemistry from destroying their own cells. Nobody has ever documented that trick working at anything larger than a smear on a lab slide. Recreational divers never go anywhere near that layer. Even the technical divers who attempt it are only certified for the first third of the hole's total depth. Danny's dive computer was found well past that line. Elena's argument to the reserve authority was simple. No diver, trained or not, panics his way past a boundary that dangerous by accident. Something about that location never added up. And for 6 years, nobody with the authority to check it seemed interested in explaining why. She has the emails to prove exactly how that went. The first year, a case manager promised a follow-up review within 90 days. The second year, a different case manager told her that manager no longer worked there. By year 4, the responses had shortened to a single line apiece, always some version of the same phrase. Current findings remained consistent with the original report. Nobody at the reserve authority ever explained what those findings actually were. What finally changed things wasn't a court order or a documentary crew. It was Rico Alvarez, a dive shop owner who trained Danny a decade earlier, who spent his own savings on an autonomous underwater drone built for oil rig inspections, one that doesn't need to breathe the water it's moving through. Rico had refused 3 times before agreeing. He'd been the one to report Danny missing, the one who spent 2 days in a rescue boat staring at a patch of empty water, and he has said publicly that some part of him always suspected the official file was wrong, but suspecting something and proving it are different debts entirely, and he wasn't sure he could afford to pay this one twice. That single detail is the whole reason any of this was possible. A diver's body can't survive the pressure and chemistry below that toxic layer for more than a few desperate minutes. A drone doesn't need to survive it at all, it just needs battery. The descent alone took nearly 2 hours, Rico piloting from a boat anchored dead center over the hole while Elena watched the feed over his shoulder, refusing every offer to sit down. For the first 30 meters, the water stayed the postcard turquoise every tourist photo of the hole promises, reef fish flashing in and out of frame like nothing below them had ever gone wrong. Then the color started leaking out of the picture, first the blue, then everything else, until the monitor showed nothing but the drone's own lights, carving a narrow tunnel through black. 90 meters. That's where the water turned the color of weak tea, the drone's own lights barely cutting 3 feet ahead of the lens. Past that layer, the terrain changes into something almost nobody has ever properly filmed. Centuries of conch shells sit piled against the walls, discarded there long before anyone alive today was born, scattered among them. Plastic bottles and shopping bags that drifted down from the surface and simply never broke apart, because almost nothing down there is alive enough to break them down. The drone's proximity sensor pinged once, low and brief, somewhere inside that shell pile. Rico logged it as debris and kept moving. It would not be the last time that stretch of wall registered as something other than empty. Then the drone's camera caught the calcite. Long, pale mineral formations hang from sections of the ceiling in that lower chamber, the kind that can only form one way. Dripping water, undisturbed for centuries, slowly building stone in open air. Stalactites don't grow underwater. They grow in caves, dry ones, before the sea ever reaches them. Roughly 10,000 years ago, this entire lower chamber sat on dry land, sealed off from the ocean by nothing but distance and time, until rising seas at the end of the last ice age flooded it from below and locked whatever was inside behind a wall of water instead of stone. There's a small interpretive sign at the dive shop dock that mentions this exact fact. The Ice Age flooding, the ancient dry cave, framed as a charming piece of geological trivia for tourists waiting on their boat. Nobody who wrote that sign seems to have asked the obvious follow-up question. Nobody sealed in a chamber for 10,000 years leaves on its own. Whatever was inside stayed inside. Rico slowed the drone near the northern wall, close to the coordinates where Danny's computer had been recovered. That's when the camera found the rest of his gear, a weight belt and a torn strap, fused into the rock face by the same thin mineral crust that had already coated the dive computer. Elena recognized the strap before Rico said a word. It was the cheap orange webbing Danny always used to replace factory gear because he liked how it looked in photos. The kind of small, stupid, specific detail that makes a missing person suddenly, unbearably present again on a boat in the middle of the afternoon. Calcification like that doesn't happen in months. It takes years of mineral-rich water settling directly onto an object without ever being disturbed. Elena has a marine geologist's written opinion confirming exactly that, and she paid for it out of her own pocket because the Reserve Authority declined to fund an independent analysis of evidence they hadn't collected themselves. You can encrust a boot buckle in calcite by accident. You cannot argue that a man's body drifted itself 300 feet into an unexplored side passage and then held perfectly still against a rock face for years while it slowly turned to stone. Something put him there, and then something kept him there. Let's pause on that for a second, because it's easy to let the horror of it slide past without sitting in it properly. If you've made it this far and you're finding this as unsettling as Elena did watching it live, go ahead and subscribe, because what the drone filmed 60 seconds later is the reason this case is finally getting reopened. Rico pushed the drone deeper into the passage the gear had come from, a tunnel narrow enough that its walls scraped static across 2 of the camera's sensors. For nearly 90 seconds, the feed showed nothing but bare rock and drifting sediment. The drone's proximity sensor pinged twice during that stretch, flagging a mass ahead too close for comfort. Both times, Rico slowed the throttle and found nothing but another outcrop of the same pale stone that lined every wall in that passage. The third ping didn't match a wall at all. And then the feed froze, not glitched, froze for 6 full seconds before either of them remembered to breathe. What came back into frame wasn't rock at all. It was a shape roughly the width of the passage itself, pale and uneven, textured almost exactly like the calcite crusting the walls around it. Motionless in a way that made it nearly indistinguishable from stone until the drone's forward light passed directly over it, and something underneath that mineral coating shifted. It didn't lunge, and it didn't flee. It simply peeled itself off the wall, unhurried, the way something moves when it has never once had a reason to expect a threat. and drifted past the lens close enough that the feed briefly lost focus entirely. Rico pulled the throttle back hard enough to nearly stall the drone. Neither of them said anything for almost a full minute. Elena has said the only thought she remembers having, watching that shape cross the frame, was that it moved exactly like something that had never once needed to hurry. That first blip near the shell pile made sense to both of them now, too. Marine biologists who've reviewed the footage since aren't willing to name it, and they're being honest, not evasive when they say that. What they will say is that it's the same trick those microbes near the shell pile use, the same mineral coating, just built at a scale nobody thought that biology could sustain. The chemistry is documented, the scale is the only part that isn't, and impossible is a different claim than non-existent. Rico pulled the drone back before its battery gave out, and neither of them said much on the ride back to shore. Elena has described that silence as the first time in 6 years she wasn't the one asking questions nobody wanted to answer. 2 weeks after Elena submitted the footage formally, the Reserve Authority reclassified that entire lower passage as ecologically sensitive and closed it to all future dives, drone or otherwise, citing sediment disturbance risk. No new independent survey has been scheduled, no timeline for one has been offered. The written statement thanked Ms. Cruz for her years of advocacy and confirmed the reserve's ongoing commitment to protecting fragile Hadal ecosystems for future generations. It never used the word footage once, and it never mentioned Danny by name. Elena has since found 2 other families online, in Mexico and in the Philippines, each describing a diver lost near a different flooded cave system. Each told some version of the same story about currents that don't quite explain where the body was eventually found. None of them have met in person yet. All 3 are trying to change that this year. Rico posted a short, unedited clip of the encounter online before the reclassification order reached his inbox. It has since been viewed more times than his dive shop has had customers in 15 years of business, and he says strangers now stop him at the gas station to ask questions he still doesn't fully know how to answer. He's not chasing that attention. He says he only ever wanted to stop being the last person who saw Danny alive and start being the person who finally helped explain why nobody saw him again. You don't close an already inaccessible passage nobody was diving anyway unless the footage from it is the actual problem. Danny's official cause of death still reads nitrogen narcosis. Elena has formally requested it be amended to undetermined pending further investigation. As of this recording, that request remains open, unanswered, sitting in the same kind of file drawer his case sat in for 6 years before a fisherman's anchor changed everything. Elena says she isn't chasing a monster anymore, and she means it. She stopped needing the Reserve Authority or a marine biologist or anyone else's official signature to tell her what she already knows happened to her brother. She knows he didn't wander off course. She knows something down there decided where he'd end up. And she knows precisely which wall to visit if she ever wants to see him again, even if she never actually can. That's not the ending she spent 6 years hoping for. It's the one she got. And for the first time since Danny disappeared, she says it finally feels like the truth instead of a guess. Danny's logbook still sits on her kitchen table, still open to that unfinished sentence. Elena hasn't closed it. She says some sentences aren't hers to finish, and she's stopped needing to. If someone in your life has ever chased down the real story behind something the paperwork called an accident, tell us about it in the comments below. Elena still checks that doc sign every time she visits, waiting for someone to finally update it, and if you want more accounts pulled straight from the deep, subscribe because Elena Cruz's 6 years are finally over, and this channel's aren't done yet.